Greetings, class. In this installment, we'll be answering the question or examining the question, what factors cause nonviolence to fail in delivering desired outcomes? And to get started, I'll be in the book at page 113, starting with a quote that's provided here. Civilization is a stream with banks. The stream is sometimes filled with blood from people killing, stealing, shouting, and doing the things historians usually record. While on the banks, unnoticed, people build homes, make love, raise children, sing songs, write poetry, and even whittle statues. The story of civilization is what happened on the banks. Will Durant. So, the fighting, the bloodshed, all of those things, right? The stream. That's what we reflect on. That's what histories are written about. That is how the story is frequently told. But civilization happens on the banks. This is an interesting way to position our examination of nonviolence. The stories are rarely told about the nonviolent successes, and as has previously been mentioned, nonviolence tends to deliver desired outcomes more effectively than violence does. Again, most people hear that, they've never heard it before, they don't believe it. Systematic analysis, however, indicates nonviolence is frequently more effective. Okay, so what factors cause nonviolence to fail? The part of the quote that I want to get to, I think, can also be captured in another kind of brief narrative that's offered by Margaret Mead, or it's kind of the characterized explanation that at one point she's famously asked, when you're studying civilizations, what do you use as the first indicator that they're civilized? The person asks, is expecting her to indicate something about technology, an arrowhead, maybe the presence or the use of a wheel, or something like that. But what she says is, when I find a healed femur. And she goes on to explain that in the wild and in nature, when animals have a broken femur, they end up left for dead. They're immobile, and they're not able to fend for themselves. So you have a civilized society when you have proof that humans have presented the capacity to care for one another and to do so with such regard that they're actually able to save someone. Right? Because it takes time for it to heal. If you go through that long process and the bone actually heals, it's a big deal. Okay, so these stories, these examples get to the part about thinking about delivering desired outcomes. When we succeed, when we prevail, when we get the positive change we want, when we heal, right? And I wanted to make sure we got to the healing part, because I actually think that this is one of the big parts where nonviolence can fail. Factors aren't achieved frequently when we fail to have the alignment that produces the outcome, and that the outcome, I think, almost always needs to be connected with, maybe not solely focused on, but connected with healing, right? So I'm a Black Lives Matter supporter. I think that we have so much evidence to showcase the abuse, the systematic abuse of minority populations by law enforcement in this country, that is in and of itself criminal. I share regularly that my political awakening comes from the experience as a 13-year-old in March of 1991 of sitting on the couch and seeing this footage of Rodney King beaten by the Los Angeles police officers. So I can support the cause, and I've done so in different ways, and maybe I failed in different ways, but that does not preclude me from challenging some of the strategic demonstrations that they've had. So when Black Lives Matter had protests in Atlanta while I was living in Georgia, they did them in a number of different ways. And one of the things that happened involved blocking and shutting down a freeway. And so blocking traffic has no direct violence, right? I mean, they're not beating people, they're not blowing stuff up. One might argue that if you're late to a medical appointment or you're stuck in traffic when you need to be at the hospital or something, that there's a certain kind of violence in that. And I would agree that there is a certain kind of violence in that. But when we think about a protest blocking traffic, we don't categorize that as being violent protest. But what we see happening, and what I think some of my research has shown, is that the moment the protester victimizes the public, they spin the injustice around, and they close what we might think of as being a sympathy gap. Right? If protesters have a legitimate challenge to abuse of power and authority, and then the protester then victimizes the other people, instead of becoming sympathetic, right? The logic of being stuck in traffic will give people the chance to see what it's like to be prejudged and discriminated against and inconvenienced. I don't think that happened. I don't think there was a single person who sat in traffic and said, now I get it. Now I know what it feels like. No, I think it was something that maybe it responded to the anger and the outrage. And I don't want to say that I can't understand the emotion of it at all, but it fails strategically because it doesn't help to encourage or increase the healing, right? If you're suffering, making others suffer more does not encourage them to help you to end your suffering. So, missing the piece on how does this movement address healing, right? So addressing healing of the self can't come, I think, at the cost of victimizing the other. That's that's not to say that Black Lives Matter should not express a desire to see offenders prosecuted and punished and so forth. Because I absolutely think that those are the things that we also need to have happen. That we won't ever get the healing and we won't ever get the trust of law enforcement until we see the proper exercise of authority, which that might have its own set of debate. But when the innocent bystanders, and maybe that's the key here, if blocking the freeway only inconvenienced the authority and the law enforcement that was being pejorative in their use of power, that would be different, but it's the public. You're injuring the rest of the public as part of the presentation, and it didn't help. It didn't help to educate the public. It didn't help to increase mobilization of a grassroots movement. It didn't help, right? Education campaigns that Black Lives Matter have done and other ways have been highly effective, right? Lots of people are actually clueless about the conditions, the on-the-ground conditions for many citizens. When people share their stories, right? Truth Telling Project coming out of Ferguson, Missouri, colleague and friend of mine, David Ragland, he's really big in this. He, they're doing good work. They're getting the stories documented, collected, shared, educating others, and increasing dialogue. And dialogue opens understanding from others so that it helps to do the healing. Right? Now, if if people are angry and blocking the freeway is better than starting a riot, all right, I can handle that too, right? Doing this nonviolent act is better than doing the violent act, right? Los Angeles riots didn't impact policy in Los Angeles Police Department, nor did the Watts riots or other episodes. But nonviolent actions following the shooting death of Iselle Ford during similar social conditions in Los Angeles had nonviolent protest, and that also led to like police chiefs and mayors and the acknowledgement what happened was wrong, his life mattered. Right? And that's important, right? It's not the justice dimension, but it's the healing dimension. So um, there's a number of factors I've highlighted here. One that I think is key. I think that nonviolence fails when it fails to deliver its desired outcome when it deviates from a pathway that involves healing. Second thing I would say is probably a much shorter description, but truth. I think that healing and truth are the two most crucial details of the efficacy of nonviolence. The strength of the movement is actually in its honest message. If you have truth on your side, if you have right on your side, the message itself is the point, right? So that you shouldn't have any detail here where it's being held back. If you're holding back, then I think that that's an indication that it's time to go back to the drawing table, figure out what is it that you really want or why you really want it. But if you're forced to be coercive or deceptive and trying to achieve your ends, and there are cases where nonviolent movements, while nonviolence is a good and effective strategy, if you're trying to use nonviolence to achieve the wrong things, that's just going to fail, right? So there might be an ideological bend here as well, that sometimes you might feel like you're right, but you're not. But if the truth is something that really rattles the collective consciousness, right? If it's not just a matter of what you want, but what is more universally accepted as the good, and you're being honest about that, people gravitate towards that sincerity, right? They see the conviction as further proof of a movement that they want to support. If they see something and it doesn't pass the smell test, if they're not sure about it, if they're not buying into the message, it doesn't matter how much you do to kind of force other people to see the message. If they don't buy it, they won't buy it. Again, the advantage of nonviolence is that if somebody doesn't buy your message, you're not necessarily hurting yourself. But again, some forms of nonviolence can be very disruptive to the positive energy and momentum. Like I said, you block traffic, and you put people in their cars and give them time to think about how upset they are that you've now delayed them from whatever it is that they have to do. You've victimized them, right? And that's not good for your movement. And I think sometimes activists make these mistakes of thinking that what they do, right, block traffic, will lead to people being self-reflective. They won't. They're going to be angry. Right? For any one person who was sitting in traffic being meditative and thinking like, I think I get what this movement's about now, there's probably 20 more saying like any support and sympathy I had for them, I've lost it all now. And I just think it's very clear that it's the healing. When the movement moves away from the healing, it moves away from the opportunity to increase support through sympathy and empathy. Thanks for tuning in. See you on the next one.